whatever happened to channel separation on audio recordings? This interesting question comes to us from Ron in Burlington, Vermont, which, Burlington, Vermont there's something that rings a bell. Was that clothing or fabric? There's some reason, that some advertising campaign or something. All right. A lot of early stereo recordings had a lead vocal or guitar coming from the left speaker only, and maybe the vocal harmonies and drums coming only from the right speaker. I love this arrangement in the recording studio process. Why has it disappeared? Does this collapse the image and soundstage? Regardless, I'd like to see it come back. You must be old enough. Yes. I don't know how old you are, buddy, but I am old enough to recall these recordings. And do you know of any modern recordings today that use the same technique? Well, I certainly am old enough to remember the Beatles, and the Beatles did that a lot. They would have, one of the Fab Four would be in one channel and one in the other, and yes, you don't hear that a whole lot anymore. And I think the answer to the question is, it was at the very beginning of stereo, and way back in the dark ages when everything was mono. I mean, if you listen to most of the old, we'll just pick on the Beatles. If you listen to most of the old Beatles recordings, the original ones were all in mono, and then very shortly after that, they kind of switched over to stereo. Well, stereo was very new, and we had this left and this right and with a center channel, and I think producers didn't really know what to do with that. So they would say, well, what the hell? We'll put one guy over here. It kind of makes sense. Here's a guy on the left. Here's a drum over here. We'll put this guy in the center. And we remember, if we've been watching these videos, that the center channel, of course, is what we call the phantom channel. It doesn't really exist, right? The center channel happens when there's equal energy in the left and the right speaker. That's when we have this center thing, and you get the same thing going into your left and your right ear. Then you get this image in the center of your head. So they had that phantom channel, and they could take a pan pot and they could pan the sound all the way to the left or to the right or somewhere in between by manipulating the left and the right volumes to where they got the positioning where they wanted. I think it wasn't until a few years later when they actually started doing what we would think of as stereo in an effort to actually make recording sound live or real. Because if you'll recall, stereo came about from a fellow named Allan Bloomline. And Allan, this was either during World War II or just slightly before World War II, quite a number of years ago. And the story goes that Allan and his wife were at a theater, a movie theater, and back then, of course, they had, that was at the very beginning of what they became known as talkies. And he was sitting there, and he, here's this big screen, and there's a guy, and the sound is coming from a single speaker, a mono speaker, in the middle of, right below the screen. They probably even had a piano player for all I know. And as the actor walked across the screen, the voice stayed here and the actor walked over here, and it was very unrealistic. And Allan Bloomline, who's, quite the genius, said, well, that doesn't make any sense. So he devised a way to have the actor be recorded in stereo so that when he moved across the screen, his voice followed the movements on the screen, so it looked more realistic. And the only way to do that would be to have 100 different speakers, not very practical, or his invention of stereo. 2 speakers, one on the far left, one on the far right, and then the center channel, which is what the ear will hear if we play equal loudness, and then it can vary like this as it pans across the screen. So that was how stereo got invented, and there was very little way to record that or to put it onto a record. We didn't have stereo records at the time. So I think it was just that transition. Now, still today, If a musician's on the left side of the room or the right side of the room, or the engineer decides, I want that guy on the left, they'll use a mono microphone, and you don't really know where he is, right? The recording engineer still puts him over on the left, still puts him over on the right. You can hear that in a lot of Dave Brubeck stuff. But very shortly after the introduction of the stereo record and the stereo tape, engineers started getting a little savvy, like, oh, this could sound like the musicians are here. And they tried to do their best to have the stereo effect so it sounded live. And today, like when we do recordings, we'll use, actually it's called the Bloomline technique, which is two microphones, one on top of the other, and one sort of 45 degrees out of phase with the other, and you put it out here and like on a drum set, and you have a live stereo sound. And sounds come from the left, sounds come from the right in a very natural fashion, which is what most of us are more interested, other than a hard pan to the left and to the right. So I hope that answers your question. All right, good one. Thanks. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye.